7 million. That's roughly how many developers have the GitHub CLI installed according to GitHub's own install count estimates. Every single one of them, as of a recent update, is now sending telemetry by default. Not after an opt-in prompt, not after a banner in the release notes that most people actually read. By default, silently, starting from the moment they upgraded. Let's be precise about what happened. GitHub pushed a change to the GHCLI that enables pseudo-anonymous telemetry collection out of the box. The official telemetry page at CLI, github.com/telemetry describes the program in general terms. They collect things like command invocations, flags used, error codes, platform information, and CLI version. The word pseudo-anonymous is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and we should pull on that thread. Pseudo-anonymous does not mean anonymous. It means the data is associated with an identifier that isn't your name or email, but that identifier can still be consistent across sessions. Depending on how that identifier is generated, and the documentation is not specific about this, it could be derived from your machine, your GitHub authentication token, or something else entirely. The telemetry page does not specify the identifier generation mechanism clearly. That's a gap. For most developers on personal machines working on public repos, this is probably a shrug. For everyone else, it deserves more scrutiny than it's getting. Here's who should actually be paying attention. If you run GH in a CI pipeline, and a lot of teams do, because it's genuinely useful for automating pull request creation, release management, artifact uploads, that pipeline is now phoning home on every run. If your CI runs on ephemeral infrastructure, you're generating telemetry events at whatever frequency your pipeline executes. If your pipeline runs hundreds of times a day, that's hundreds of telemetry events per day per pipeline, all going to GitHub's collection infrastructure. Whether that matters to you depends on your threat model and your compliance posture, but you should at least know it's happening. The air-gapped case is where this gets operationally interesting in a bad way. A lot of enterprises run GH in environments that are intentionally isolated from the internet. Internal GitHub enterprise deployments, classified networks, financial systems behind strict egress controls. In those environments, the telemetry call is going to fail. That failure mode matters. Does GH fail silently when telemetry can't be sent? Does it log an error? Does it retry and introduce latency? Does it block? The documentation does not answer this clearly, which is exactly the kind of thing that turns into a 2 a.m. incident when someone notices their internal tooling is generating a flood of connection, timeout errors, to an external endpoint they've never seen before. For regulated deployments, think SOC2, HIPAA-adjacent environments, FedRAMP. The question isn't just whether data is being exfiltrated, it's whether the data collection mechanism itself needs to appear in your data flow diagrams, your vendor assessments, and your audit documentation. If you have a compliance team, they are going to ask you what data GH sends to GitHub, and pseudo-anonymous command invocations is not a complete answer. You need to know the full data schema, the retention period, and whether that data can be linked back to individuals under any circumstances. None of that is clearly specified in the current documentation. Now, to be fair about what GitHub did right, they do provide an opt-out. You can disable telemetry by setting the environment variable GH no analytics to 1, or by running GH config set analytics false. The opt-out mechanism exists and it works. The problem is the default. Opt-out telemetry in a developer tool that runs in automated pipelines and sensitive environments should have come with more explicit communication than a documentation page that most people only find when they go looking for it. The release notes for the version that introduced this change mentioned it, but release notes for CLI tools are famously underread. If you want to verify whether your current installation is sending telemetry, you can check your GH config file, typically located at the path returned by GH config list, and look for the analytics setting. What's actually in the telemetry payload beyond what the documentation describes is unclear from the reporting. GitHub's page lists categories rather than a complete schema. It says they collect subcommand and flag usage, but doesn't enumerate which flags. Some flags carry user-supplied values. For example, the repo name in GH repo clone is a flag value. Whether flag values are collected or just flag presence is a meaningful distinction that the current documentation does not resolve. If flag values are collected, that's a different privacy conversation than if only flag names are collected. GitHub probably has good intentions here, but probably is not an auditable control. The broader pattern worth naming: this is a well-established Silicon Valley playbook. Ship opt-out telemetry, document it on a page that requires you to know it exists, and frame it as helping us improve the product. That framing isn't wrong. Telemetry genuinely does help product teams prioritize work. But the asymmetry of information between the company that wrote the tool and the engineer running it in a regulated environment is real, and the burden of discovering and opting out falls entirely on the user. GitHub is a Microsoft subsidiary. Microsoft has a long and complicated history with telemetry defaults, going back to Windows 10 diagnostics and the subsequent regulatory scrutiny in Europe. They know how to write telemetry documentation that satisfies legal review. The current GH telemetry page reads like a first draft. That might change as more people push back, but right now it's thin. Here is what you should actually do with this information. First, audit your CI pipelines and developer workstations for GH installations. Run GH config list and check the analytics value. If it's not explicitly set to false and you're in a regulated or air-gapped environment, set it now. The environment variable GH no analytics equals 1 works in CI without touching config files, which is the cleaner approach for ephemeral runners. Second, if you manage a platform team or internal developer tooling, push this to your developer experience documentation as a known configuration requirement, the same way you document proxy settings or certificate trust stores. Third, if you're on a compliance or security team, add GitHub CLI to your data flow inventory and file a formal question with GitHub about the complete telemetry schema and data retention policy. Their enterprise support channel is the right place for that, not the public docs. The documentation will improve faster if enterprise customers with contracts are asking pointed questions. The real story here is not that GitHub is doing something uniquely malicious. It's that opt-out telemetry in infrastructure tooling is becoming normalized, and the operational implications for teams running these tools in automated, regulated, or isolated environments are consistently underspecified at launch. Every tool that does this is individually low risk. Collectively, they represent a growing surface area of undocumented external calls in your build and deployment infrastructure. That surface area deserves the same attention you'd give to any other third-party dependency.